All right, so let's just, we're just on the hour, so let's give just a little bit of time for people to just come in.
Okay.
Just come in. So welcome everyone. We are gonna start in, say, 1 minute or 1.5 minutes to give a little bit more time for people to come in. And whoever is already on Zoom, welcome. And I also welcome everyone who will be watching this later on YouTube.
My dog's starting to eat stuff, so hopefully it doesn't get too loud.
Let's see. All right, let me get started with your bio in the meantime. So good afternoon and good morning, everyone. Good morning for Cory, good afternoon for myself, and whoever is watching this, perhaps even good evening. It's my great pleasure to introduce Cory Clark for today's Mindvoyage lecture. Cory is a distinguished behavioral scientist whose work has significantly contributed to our understanding of social cognition and human judgment. She completed her PhD at the University of California, Irvine. She specialized in social and personality psychology and quantitative methods, and she also holds a BA in psychology and philosophy from Ohio University. Her research delves into understanding the way social motivation influence human judgment and empirical beliefs. She's interested, her interest spans from areas such as psychology, including social cognition, judgment, and decision-making, bias, moral, political science, and also meta-science. Her work highlights the evolutionary roots of human cognition, particularly its role in helping individuals avoid ostracism and attain social status. She investigates how our reasoning is often aimed at persuading others of our moral righteousness and social group commitment, leading to cognitive biases despite our concerns for truth and accuracy. In the moral domain, Cory has explored how the belief in free will is motivated by the desire to blame and punish others, which helps justify punishment and mitigate retaliation. In the political domain, her research demonstrates that both liberals and conservatives exhibit double standards in evaluating information and behavior, showing a bias towards information that supported their ideological views, while being skeptical of opposing information. Also, Cory investigates motivated cognition among scientists, revealing that fear of peer ostracism can lead to self-censorship and biased scientific discourse. She advocates for adversarial collaborations. She runs the PEN Adversarial Collaborations Project, which if you haven't, seen, or if you haven't visited her website, I strongly recommend you to do. Adversarial collaborations are methods to try to attempt to resolve disagreements among scholars by designing research based on competing hypotheses and promoting fair and unbiased scientific inquiry. So welcome Cory to her talk, where she's going to talk today about taboos and self-censorship among psychology professors. And if you ask yourself, what is this question? The question she's trying to ask is, how much censorship exists in academia? Who imposes it? How frequently it happens? And while we think of science as pristine and just means in which we try to discover the truth, science is also conducted by humans who have some practices and beliefs that bring to their practices. And she's trying to resolve how do we reconcile the truth or truth-seeking with being human. So thank you, Cory, for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Oh, let me see if I got my slides. There we go. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a paper of mine that just came out last week. So this is fresh off the press, and this paper is maybe like a little bit controversial, and because I was aware of that possibility, I haven't talked much about this paper before it came out. So you guys are really my guinea pigs for this talk. I haven't given it before. And yeah, it's about scientific controversy. It's not itself meant to be a scientific controversy. It's supposed to understand what kinds of topics in mostly the social behavioral sciences are controversial. How much are people self-censoring? What do people think we should do with controversial scholarship, and how we should treat scholars who forward controversial conclusions. So that's what it's looking at. But anyway, yeah, thanks for having me. And let's get into it. So probably many of you are familiar with the story of Cope and Marsh. These are two paleontologists who got into fierce competition in the late 1800s over discovering the most dinosaur fossils. So they became enemies over time, and because they both wanted to outcompete the other and be, the leading paleontologist who's contributed the most to understanding of dinosaur fossils, they resorted to all kinds of unprofessional tactics and tried to ruin each other's reputation to some degree successfully, humiliate each other. And they also would ruin fossils and damage digging sites after they had gone through them so that their competitor couldn't discover fossils at those digging sites. So they both harmed the field of paleontology, but they actually both were super productive and contributed a lot to paleontology because they were so motivated by their conflict and their competition to be highly productive scientists. And this rivalry became known as both the Bone Wars and the Great Dinosaur Rush because it was so hostile, but it was also so productive. And I think this kind of thing is really common in science. We have so many conflicts, so many wars. Here are a couple that just a quick Google scholar of like wars in academia. We have the consciousness wars, the rationality wars, the tobacco wars, the vaccination wars. There are wars all over the place, probably in all fields of science because I'm running this adversarial collaboration project. People email me all the time about their dramas. And so I've heard about wars in studying butterflies and wars in studying, sugar and fat and hyper processed foods or ultra processed foods, I think it's called. So we have these conflicts in science, and even though sometimes they can be pretty unpleasant and interpersonally annoying, often they result in progress, and scientists become highly motivated to collect more and better data, forward more persuasive arguments, and then hopefully over time we can come to understand what's true. But in addition to these kinds of empirical conflicts, we also have normative conflicts, and these are even more challenging because they're not as easily resolved with the collection of data. So just for one example, just in the past 10 or so years, about 10, 15 years, some scholars have been pushing for open science practices, getting scholars to pre-register their hypotheses and their methods and their analyses, to share all their data and their methods openly. And a lot of people have responded favorably to these norm changes, and they were a very big change to the normal procedures. But not everyone has responded to these norm changes favorably. So I have a couple good ones over here. Like this one I like, Bropen Science. It's accusing the open science movement of being like a bro movement. So even though we have like these norm changes in science, some people resist, and sometimes it results in name calling. And scientists are equipped to address empirical conflicts. Of course, sometimes it takes us a very, very, very long time to resolve empirical conflicts, but normative conflicts pose this higher challenge because we have to figure out how can we address this disagreement in a way that's consistent with scientific practices. And so what I'll say here is that I'm trying to, initiate a research program that's trying to look at some of the empirical assumptions underlying our normative conflicts in science. So I think what we've been seeing in the past 10-ish years is a growing normative conflict in science between what I'll call morally responsible science and academic freedom. So there have been so for example, the Springer Nature family of journals, one of the most probably prestigious science outlet, or rather the science publisher, I guess, they have put out a series of editorials and changed their publication guidelines to explicitly put moral concerns into the peer review process. So they say things like, information that has potential to undermine the dignity of human social groups potentially will be rejected or retracted on those grounds. So that's this insertion of moral consideration, not regarding how participants are treated in the collection of data, but rather moral concerns about the conclusions themselves. So what could happen if this conclusion was published and went out into the world? how would people react to that, and could it harm people? On the other side, you have people who are very concerned about academic freedom and upholding pursuit of truth as really the only goal, or definitely the primary goal, possibly the only goal of science. And they consider these kinds of moral concerns to be illegitimate censorship, not a legitimate part of the scientific process at all. So this is kind of what I'm looking at in the present project, is this conflict between these two perspectives. So I'm looking at, I have my like thing and it's blocking my own view. Let's see. I'll put it over there. So yeah, I'm identifying conflict in modern academia and psychology in particular, and I also put in the US in particular, because I'm looking at only professors in the United States. So a lot of the conflicts that I'm going to talk about will be more relevant in the US than elsewhere. However, I do think the themes of these conflicts are probably similar, at least throughout, Europe, the Western world, let's say. So I'm looking at a set of controversial empirical conclusions, and then I'm looking at how psychology professors think we should treat scholarship that is controversial, and how we should treat scholars who forward these controversial conclusions. And I'm just adding the caveat, my research does not and cannot resolve these empirical debates. So I'm not trying to say something is true or not. And it also can't resolve the normative debates, because I'm just saying, what do people think, not what is actually right. But again, I'm hoping we can start to look at these normative conflicts in a way that is relying on empirical reality. Okay. Yeah, I want to say I have like a lot of data in this talk, and I even have, for my qualitative portion, I have like a lot of text. So if at any point people are confused, I guess people can't interrupt me, huh, Lucia? I was gonna say you can just jump in and
No, they
interrupt.
can't, but they can actually, there's a Q&A. So if they
Can I
want,
see that?
they can, you should be able to see it. So if anyone
Okay.
wants to, so they can just, or they can raise their hand.
Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure people don't get lost along the way, but we'll see. I'll try to be clear, and then maybe we won't need that.
Yep.
Okay. All right, so I first interviewed a set of 41 people who have PhDs in psychology or psychology adjacent fields, like other areas of the behavioral sciences, and then I used the responses in those interviews to generate a survey, which I then had 470 psychology professors complete. So the first question I asked in these interviews was, are there empirical conclusions in your field that are off limits, in the sense that if you reported data supporting that conclusion, you would be formally or informally punished, shunned, or ostracized by peers? If so, what are those conclusions? 90% of people said yes. And then they elaborated on what those taboo conclusions were. 86.8% of people mentioned group differences. So as an overarching theme of all of the kinds of things that are taboo, not all of them, but a lot of them tend to fall under this category of group differences. People specified a variety of additional features of these taboo conclusions. So I'll run through them. And I also will say, I've tried to use a lot of the verbatim language that participants used, just so you can get a sense of how scholars are saying conceptually similar things, but describing them in a variety of different ways, just so you can see how how there appears to be this certain kind of consensus, even though people think about these issues slightly differently. So 76.3% of people specifically mentioned race differences, 28.9% mentioned sex or gender differences. 47.4% mentioned differences in IQ, intelligence, cognitive skills, intellectual domains or pursuits, or smartness. 44.1% mentioned differences in other domains, such as school and academic performance and educational outcomes, work and occupational performance, self-control, criminality and police contact, mating behaviors or attraction, professions, sprinting speed, socioeconomic status, violence, racial biases and hate crime rates, general abilities and competencies or general achievement, any socially or societally valued outcomes or traits, or any unipolar behavior or outcome where it is easy to assign a good and bad end. So really what I think we see here is the taboo conclusions are about group differences, specifically regarding racial groups or sex or gender differences, and particularly in domains that are very socially important. 57.9% mentioned that these group differences are taboo specifically if they're attributed to genetic, biological, evolved, natural, innate, inherent, intrinsic, internal, essentialist, immutable, concrete, immovable, or nativist causes or explanations. 21.1% contrasted them with accepted causal explanations, including society, social environments or socialization, structuralist frameworks, discrimination, oppression, trauma, bad schools, nurture, or blank slateism. So these, when you're describing group differences and socially important outcomes, it's more off limits to attribute them to something natural, whereas it's more accepted if you attribute it to something social or environmental. 23.7 reported that if the explanation is perceived as blaming the group or victim, perpetuating ism, stigmatizing, confirming racist stereotypes, justifying future or past harms, or different treatment, or attributing fault or responsibility because of a group's behavior or culture. So these kinds of natural conclusions that potentially can be viewed as, blaming the victim for their relatively poor performance on some socially important outcome. Those are the kinds of conclusions that are off limits. And 60.5% mentioned that it's a particular group that cannot be portrayed negatively. 47.4% said Black people or African Americans, 13.2% said women, 31.6% mentioned broader categories such as oppressed or vulnerable groups, non-white people or people of color, racial or ethnic minorities, underrepresented minorities, or racial groups with subordinate positions. So it's group differences, but it's group differences in socially important outcomes if it's attributed to something natural, and particularly if a group that's considered to be disadvantaged in society is the one being portrayed more negatively. Okay. So outside of those kinds of conclusions, that huge set of conclusions that would fit within that category of taboo conclusions, there were a variety of other taboos as well, of course. LGBTQ issues came up relatively often, biases in academia, different kinds of biases, political biases, racial biases, gender biases, and some evolutionary claims. So to construct my list of taboos, I considered both how popular is this taboo conclusion, how many people mentioned it as a taboo conclusion, but I also wanted to bring in some diversity to have different types of taboo conclusions. So I only asked people about 10. And I also asked in these interviews about what are you afraid of if you were to study these topics or come to these conclusions, and what do you think should happen to other scholars who come to these conclusions, just to make sure that I was asking the right kinds of questions and providing the right kinds of response options when I conducted the survey. Okay, so for my main study, I gathered the email addresses of all of the psychology professors at the top 130 institutions in the United States. That was about 4,600 people, 470 participated. So my response rate is only about 10%. So not necessarily perfectly representative. However, to address that question, I coded my sample. Well, I had data on my sample for gender, age, ideology, and career stage. And then I selected a random 300 members of my entire population, all 4,600 professors. And I coded them along those same metrics. Ideology, it was more complicated. If you're interested in that, I can tell you how I did ideology. But anyway, my sample seemed closely representative along those 4 categories. So I don't think my sample is particularly unusual either compared to these 4,600 professors. Okay, so the 10 taboos. I asked 3 questions for each of the 10 taboo conclusions. So this is, how much do you believe the taboo conclusion is true? How much do you self-censor? So how reluctant are you? Is this a comment? I see more. Q&A. Oh, okay. Okay. I don't think that's a clarification question right now, so we can deal with that later. Yeah, so I asked them how reluctant they are to share their views openly, their empirical beliefs openly, and how much do they want to discourage other scholars from, okay, now there's another one. Maybe Lucia, you can 10%. Oh, fear. I have no idea. I actually possibly fear. Possibly professors are busy. Possibly I went to spam. I'm not really sure. Although I should say 10% is not unusual. If you look at rates of participation in these kinds of studies, sometimes it's as low as 2%. people do up to like 30% if it's a smaller community where the scholars know everybody in that community, because this was all psychology professors. Probably a lot of them didn't know my name. So I don't think 10% is probably unusual. Okay, and then I asked them how much, yeah, they wanted to discourage other people from, it keeps popping up. I'll stop. Lucy, if there's an important one, just let me know.
I will, sorry. Yeah, I did not know
Yeah,
that
okay.
the audience could see the question. So the first one was, why did only 10% of professor respond? Is it fear? So thank you, Geoff, for bringing that up. So I will read.
Okay, so these are the 10 taboo conclusions I asked people about. The tendency to engage in sexually coercive behavior likely evolved because it conferred some evolutionary advantages on men who engaged in such behavior. Gender biases are not the most important drivers of the underrepresentation of women in STEM fields. Academia discriminates against Black people in hiring, promotions, grants, invitations to participate. That one, I should say, was nominated by 2 people as a taboo conclusion, but in the study, we discovered it's actually more taboo to say that's false than true. And that made it hang way better with all the other taboo conclusions. So that one eventually is treated as disagreeing with that is taboo. Biological sex is binary for the vast majority of people. The social sciences in the United States discriminate against conservatives in hiring, promotions, grants, invitations to participate in colloquia, symposia. Racial biases are not the most important drivers of higher crime rates among Black Americans relative to white Americans. Men and women have different psychological characteristics because of evolution. Genetic differences explain non-trivial variance in race differences and intelligence test scores. That one, I think, is the most taboo conclusion right now, at least the most taboo conclusion that people will say out loud. I think there are probably other taboo conclusions that people wouldn't even think of because they're so taboo, but that's the most taboo one people will mention. Transgender identity is sometimes the product of social influence, and demographic diversity, such as race and gender, in the workplace often leads to worse performance. So what do we see? There are a few things to note here. So first, along the x-axis, you have how much professors believe the statements are true. This is 100% certainty it's true. This is 100% certainty it's false. And then along the y-axis, we have self-censorship. So the things that I think are worth noting here is that for every single one of these conclusions, some professors were 100% certain they were true, and some were 100% certain they were false. We often had pretty large standard deviations, indicating that there's really nothing that I think would be approaching a scientific consensus on any of these conclusions. We also see that almost all professors are self-censoring, at least somewhat, on at least some conclusions, so fairly high rates of self-censorship. And we also see these positive associations. This is the one where this is the more taboo conclusion, or sorry, this is the more taboo conclusion to say it's false. We see these associations where the more people believe these controversial conclusions are empirically accurate, the more they're self-censoring their own empirical beliefs. And this almost certainly creates misperceptions regarding scientific consensuses, and biases are estimates toward thinking most scientists think these conclusions are true, because the ones who think they're false, because the ones who think they're true won't say so out loud, whereas the ones who think they're false are much more vocal. I asked professors, if you were to share your empirical beliefs openly, how at risk would you feel for the following consequences? I highlight your empirical beliefs here because I'm not asking them, how much trouble would you get in if you said the worst thing you can think of? I said, how much trouble would you get in if you said what you believe to be true out loud? So your own empirical beliefs. You can see professors are quite concerned about getting attacked on social media, being ostracized by their peers, being stigmatized or labeled pejorative terms, moderately concerned about career-damaging biases against them, guilt by association harm to their students and to their colleagues, student boycotts, and then relatively less concerned about disciplinary actions, such as losing classes or leadership roles, not too concerned about threats of physical violence or especially getting fired. However, I will note that only 40% of people had no concern about getting fired. And this is, again, for if they just said what they believe is empirically correct out loud, they think they would increase their risks of getting fired. We also saw no differences in perceptions of any of these risks between tenured and untenured professors. And we also saw that tenured professors are self-censoring just as much as untenured professors. And I think one reason for this is that these are the things professors are most concerned about. They're afraid of being called names on social media and of being ostracized by their peers. And tenure does nothing to protect people from that. So it does raise the question. I know not all countries have tenure, rather tenure is treated differently in different places, or whatever, they have different names for things. But yeah, I think it raises the question of whether having that kind of job security is actually giving professors the freedom to pursue whatever they believe is empirically correct, because you can't really control whether people are going to call you names on social media. So people are still self-censoring at pretty high rates. I asked professors, imagine a scholar who forwarded a genetic or evolutionary explanation for gender or racial differences in socially valued outcomes in their research. Which of the following actions would you support against him or her? We see very little support for any consequences except for normal scientific criticism. Almost everybody supports normal scientific criticism. Very little support for removing them from leadership positions, disinviting them from talks, not hiring or promoting them even if they meet typical standards, socially ostracizing them, refusing to publish their work regardless of its merits, shaming them on social media, publicly labeling them pejorative terms such as bigot, racist, or sexist, firing them, or stigmatizing their graduate students or co-authors. So one thing you can see here is almost no psychology professors support any of these kinds of things, yet psychology professors are very scared of those kinds of things. They're way more afraid of those things happening to them than they support doing those things to other people. And again, this is people who are reporting the most taboo conclusions. So even people who are providing genetic or evolutionary explanations and socially valued outcomes, people don't support punishing them. And mostly people think we should just be criticizing their work, you know, in peer review and commentaries and things like that. I
Cory,
asked,
there is a question from the audience.
okay,
Ostracized by peers is second place. Should not professors feel safe discussing different ideas?
you mean in terms of what they're afraid of?
I assume so. I don't know, Anton, do you have a comment for us? Yes, she says yes.
Yes. Yeah, so I kind of want to see the yes. So that's a normative question. Should professors feel safe discussing different ideas? I would say yes. But what this shows is they don't. So yeah, we have an environment currently where a lot of professors are afraid to say what they believe is empirically correct to their peers because they're afraid of being ostracized by their peers. Whether that's an optimal situation is, I suppose, up for debate. But yeah, in my dream world of science, people would be free to speak openly, at least to their peers, right? At least, you know, at conferences and things like that, if not publicly.
Here's another question.
Okay.
Does certainty in either direction, true or false, regarding the taboo statement correlates with the inclination to self-censor or censor others?
Yes. So that first slide I showed, let's see if I can go back. And I need to close this too. Oops. Sorry. This slide shows that people who believe the conclusions are true self-censor more. I didn't show a slide for it, but also, I think I mentioned this later in the talk, that people who think the conclusions are true are less desirous of discouraging research. So people who think the taboos are false want to discourage the research more than people who think they're true, but people who think they're true are self-censoring more than people who think they're false. So what you have on the low end is people who people who think taboo conclusions are false, speak openly about their empirical beliefs and don't want other people studying these topics anymore. Whereas people who think they're true want people studying these topics more, but they don't speak their own empirical beliefs openly. So that's the general pattern across all of these conclusions. Okay. Here are desires to discourage. I just gave you one piece of information about these desires to discourage research, but the more important piece, perhaps, is that desires to discourage research are very low across the board. So as I said, this genetic contribution to intelligence differences between races is probably the most taboo conclusion. But even for this one, desires to discourage research into this conclusion are very low. This one had the most variance too. So this is the most, I think, contentious one where some people really, really want to discourage it, but most people don't want to discourage it at all. And most people don't want to discourage any of the taboo conclusions. As you can see, they're very near floor for almost all of the taboo conclusions. So scholars are generally supportive of their peers pursuing any of these controversial conclusions. Again, this appears to be, in my view, to be in contrast to how afraid everyone is of consequences. Everyone is self-censoring and they're afraid of all of these punishments, but people don't really want to punish their peers for studying these conclusions, and they don't want to discourage people from studying them either. So I think what I'm seeing is a disconnect between what psychology professors think their peers think and what they really think. And I'll get more into that as I go forward. Okay. I asked professors, how certain should it be that a social scientific finding is going to cause harm before it should be suppressed? The modal response is we should never suppress social scientific findings, but the vast majority of people are up here. There should be evidence that the only way to avoid the harm is to suppress the research, and there should be clear evidence it would cause harm. So most people think we should either never be suppressing research, or if we are, it should only be in cases when there's clear evidence that this finding would cause harm, and there's no other way of avoiding that harm. Very few people support these thresholds. There should be suggestive evidence it would cause harm. The harm should seem likely, the harm should seem possible. Now, I find this interesting because some of these new editorial guidelines seem to be maybe in this box, maybe in this one, but somewhere down here. They say things like, what do they say? Oh, has potential. This finding has potential to undermine the dignity of human social groups. Well, what is has potential? That's certainly not, if we have clear evidence that this finding is going to cause harm, then we might reject or retract it. It's if we have an intuition that this has potential to cause harm. So if that's an accurate characterization of those policies, almost no psychology professors think that that's a legitimate threshold for the suppression of science. Most people would want much higher evidence before we would be rejecting or retracting papers based on harm concerns or moral concerns. I asked.
There is one more question.
Okay.
It's, could a professor vote for more than one response?
No, not on that one. No. Okay. Every time I open this, I lose how to, okay, there we go. I asked, sorry, every time I click. Okay. I asked professors how legitimate various reasons were for retracting papers. So pretty much everyone thinks it's legitimate to be retracting papers in cases of data fraud, and pretty legitimate if there are analytic errors that alter the primary conclusion, and also failure to obtain ethics approval. To my surprise, people were actually somewhat supportive of retracting papers if there's compelling evidence of p-hacking, but we saw generally little support for multiple failures to replicate, and especially for moral concerns that the conclusions could harm vulnerable groups and risks of extremists misconstruing and weaponizing the results. So we see here again, people generally don't think that these are legitimate reasons to be retracting papers, and in fact, they're way more supportive of retracting papers for compelling evidence of p-hacking. I find this interesting again because, to my knowledge, papers have been retracted for these reasons, but I've never seen a paper retracted for this reason. So what's happening is not supported by most people, and what's not happening is supported by most people. So that raises the question of why. Why is this happening? I asked professors how legitimate various reasons are to fire professors. And the results are very similar to retracting papers. So professors think it's very legitimate to fire a professor who's committed data fraud. They're pretty supportive of firing professors who've had sex with their students, and you probably won't be surprised to hear there's a gender difference here, where men are less supportive of firing professors for sleeping with their students than female professors are. They're moderately supportive of firing professors for compelling evidence of p-hacking, below the midpoint though. And not supportive for numerous failures to replicate, moral concerns about the implications of their conclusions, or because their research has become popular with extremist groups. Again, I think this is happening. Professors are getting fired because of moral concerns about their research conclusions, and not for compelling evidence of p-hacking, to my knowledge. But people support this more than they support firing professors for moral reasons. I asked professors, how much admiration versus contempt do you hold toward peers who who start petitions or social media campaigns to retract papers for the following reasons? And those 3 reasons I gave them were data fraud, research errors, and moral concerns. So we'll start with data fraud. So on the y-axis, we have, X, right? I'm getting my axes, whatever. Anyway, on the bottom, on the low end is maximum contempt. That is the phrasing I used, maximum contempt. And on the high end is maximum admiration and respect. And these are bins on a 101-point sliding scale from 0 to 100. So for data fraud, professors actually quite admire and respect these folks. The modal response is up here in the maximum admiration and respect, and people generally trending toward positive views of people who petition to get these papers retracted. For research errors, people are much more on the fence and much more spread out. So a lot of people don't change their views at all. Some people come to hate these folks more. Some people admire them more. The mean is, I think, something like 42 or 45. So it is trending toward having negative reputational consequences for professors who petition retract papers on the basis of errors, as opposed to data fraud, where they're more supportive of that. Moral concerns about the conclusions shows precisely the opposite pattern as for data fraud. So the modal response, and by a long shot, is in the maximum contempt zone, and people generally are on the negative end. So scholars who petition to retract papers on the basis of moral concerns about the conclusion are likely paying a huge reputational price and losing the respect and admiration of potentially the vast majority of their peers when they participate in these. I asked professors, should scholars be completely free to pursue research questions without fear of institutional punishment for their conclusions? Most people said yes, but we also see a pretty striking gender difference here, where the majority of men say yes, fewer say it's complicated, and almost nobody says no. With women, almost nobody says no, but the majority of women say it's complicated and fewer say yes. Similarly, I asked, if pursuit of truth and social equity goals appear to come into conflict, which should scientists prioritize? Most people said truth, but the vast majority of men said truth, and fewer said it's complicated. Almost none said equity. With women, the majority said it's complicated, fewer said truth, and almost none said equity. I see these differences across almost the whole entire survey, also with age and political ideology. So younger, more left-leaning and female professors, pretty much across the board, are more opposed to controversial scholarship and scholars compared to older, more politically right-leaning, and by right-leaning, I mean more centrist, because almost the whole sample is on the left side of the political spectrum. So to be right-leaning means to be basically moderate. And male professors. So we see that younger, more left-leaning and female professors are more desirous of discouraging controversial research. Almost all of the taboo conclusions, they want to discourage scholars from pursuing those more. They're more supportive of retracting papers and firing scholars for moral reasons. They're more supportive of nearly all of the punitive actions toward taboo scholars. I think the one exception was normal scientific criticism. And then also, I know women didn't want to stigmatize grad students and colleagues, but otherwise, I think these groups were more supportive of calling them names, ostracizing them, not hiring them even if they meet typical standards, not publishing their papers even if they have merit. Women, left-leaning and younger professors are more supportive of those. Less likely to believe that there are taboo conclusions in the social sciences. So I didn't report this question, but it was similar to the question I asked in the interviews. It was something like, are there conclusions in the social sciences that are off limits in the sense that they have empirical support, but if you mentioned that empirical support out loud, you would get punished. Younger, more left-leaning and female professors are more likely to say that there are no conclusions like that everything is on the table. They also self-censor their own empirical beliefs less. And I think this is potentially because they also hold more socially desirable empirical beliefs. They are more likely to think the taboo conclusions are false. So I have here, these are gender differences in taboo beliefs. So for every single taboo conclusion, men believe these conclusions are true more than women do. So to just give you a few examples, for binary biological sex, or the claim that biological sex is binary for the vast majority of people, male psychology professors are pretty sure this is true, whereas females are much more on the fence. For the claim that men and women have different psychological characteristics because of evolution, men are pretty sure this is true, whereas women are much more on the fence. For the claim that there's a genetic contribution to racial differences in IQ scores, women are very certain this is false, whereas men are more on the fence. For the claim that there is racial bias in academia, women are quite certain this is true, whereas men are more on the fence. So we see this pattern across the taboo conclusions where men believe them more, consequently men self-censor more, and women are more desirous of censoring these topics or discouraging their peers from pursuing these topics. We also saw across pretty much the whole survey, we tended to see that people who believed the taboo conclusions were true self-censored their own beliefs more, but had lower desire to censor other people or to stop other people from pursuing those conclusions. They were less supportive of retracting papers based on moral concerns and less supportive of firing or otherwise punishing peers based on moral concerns. So it's kind of almost like there are two types of professor, where one group is, I don't want to say they believe the taboo conclusions are true because that's not, like people were all over the board on that one, as you saw, but there are kinds of people who are self-censoring at really high levels, but they don't want to censor other people and they don't want to punish other people. They want people to pursue truth first and foremost, and they're opposed to moral concerns interfering with science. And then there's another group that's very vocal about their own empirical beliefs, but they're highly supportive of punishing their peers and discouraging their peers from pursuing controversial conclusions. That former group is much larger than the latter group. The latter group appears to be a very small minority, actually. So to summarize, basically, I want to see how I'm doing on time too. Oh, cool, perfect. So I think the main things that I find in this research is scholars have very strong disagreement on whether these controversial conclusions are true. There's nothing resembling a scientific consensus suggesting that these are still open scientific questions. We haven't resolved these yet. There's quite a bit of fear of consequences for speaking openly about people or professors' own empirical beliefs. They fear consequences much more than they support consequences. So there's some kind of asymmetry where fear is much higher than the reality, at least regarding sheer numbers of people who support punishing their peers. There's very little desire to discourage research into even the most controversial conclusions. Very little support for retracting papers or punishing peers based on moral concerns about research conclusions. And there's a great deal of contempt for peers who petition to retract on moral grounds. So this vocal minority who's very opposed to pursuing and publishing and disseminating controversial conclusions is very disliked among the larger academic community. So yeah, this is my question. I'll be interested in what you guys think. If so few scholars wish to discourage taboo research and do not support the punishment of taboo scholars and strongly dislike peers who aim to interfere with science for moral reasons, why are scholars self-censoring so much and so fearful of social sanctions from their peers? And I have at least 3 possibilities. One is there's pluralistic ignorance that has led scholars to overestimate peer opposition to controversial conclusions. Because there's such high levels of self-censorship, nobody knows that everybody's opposed to rejecting and retracting papers on the basis of moral concerns. Everyone believes that everyone else really would come after them if they were to say one of these conclusions out loud, when most people wouldn't, and they don't support that. And in fact, they dislike the people who do support that. So it could be because everyone's self-censoring, nobody knows where everybody stands. And so we're kind of in this place of extreme ignorance where we think social costs are really high, but actually social costs are high for the people who are trying to shut down research. If that's the case, then potentially my results, if people can see, oh, if that's how my peers feel about this kind of thing, maybe it will embolden more people to not self-censor as much. Another possibility is that scholars, because they are generally highly ambitious people and they care a lot about their social reputations, that they might be willing to make the trade-off and self-censor their own empirical beliefs to avoid, provoking even a small group of people that they consider to be sort of obnoxious thorn in the side of academia. So it might be that scholars don't misjudge the majority minority situation. It might be that the minority is just that intimidating, and that it's not worth it to them. They're not willing to pay a potential reputational risk to speak up. And if that's the case, then we might have a bit of a collective action problem happening in academia, where because nobody's willing to pay that reputational price to speak up, everyone stays silent, and then the vocal minority has way more power than they would if everybody would stop self-censoring together. And of course, it's possible that my data are unrepresentative or otherwise flawed or misleading somehow. So I'm not opposed to that possibility, and I really, really hope other scholars will try to replicate these findings in other samples and other countries and other disciplines, and other types of institutions. So I did draw from the top 130. So these tend to be relatively prestigious schools, research universities that contribute a lot to, publishing, but it doesn't include like smaller schools that are more like teaching oriented or like community colleges types of places. So it's still possible that if you pulled in all of the psychology professors in the United States, things would look different. Yeah, as promised, my data here don't actually help resolve any of these conflicts. They don't resolve the empirical conclusions, and they don't resolve the norm. Even if I now am pretty sure that the popular normative view is that that we should not be considering potential harms when we make decisions about whether papers should be published or whether scholars should be hired or fired. But that doesn't necessarily mean that is the right normative stance to have. It could be that the minority is correct. But my motivation really with conducting this work was, we've been having these debates and fights on social media and places, and it gets really hostile and ugly, and we start calling each other names. And I think we've been appealing to our intuitions and saying, on one side, maybe saying, no, truth is the principal goal of science. Well, why? On the other side saying, no, like this finding could cause genocide. Well, what makes you say that? And I think we need to, if we're going to resolve this debate, this conflict amicably and professionally, then I think we need to start testing some of the empirical assumptions underlying our normative conflicts. And so I hope this is just a little step in that direction, and I hope other people will get involved and start testing some of these empirical claims that are used to support our normative, our intuitions in these conflicts. I think that's all. Yep. So if you're interested in the paper, it came out last week. Here, and then if you're just interested in this topic, I had another paper come out a few months ago, which is more of a review, but at the end of that paper, I outline a like a research agenda with a lot of questions that we don't know the answers to. And that bear on the question of, should we be censoring science? If so, when? What are the consequences of censoring or not censoring? How big are those consequences? What are the long-term consequences? Things like that. Anyway, it's a long list. But if you're interested in getting involved in this research, then there are some preliminary ideas to check out potentially. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Cory. This was a, very, very illuminating discussion and very interesting data. There is 4 questions in the Q&A, and then of course I have plenty. So let me just fire them up for you. So one is from Anton. Diversity and workforce performance is disclaimed by women, while the female rate in higher US academic institutions is growing. What could be your explanation for such a voting against facts?
This came by women while the female rate in higher institutions. I think I don't quite understand the question. So in my paper, the claim was, and maybe that's not what you're asking, but the claim was diversity in the workplace is often, I think, bad for productivity, not necessarily that women are underrepresented, but I do agree with you that people seem to not be acknowledging the fact that women are dominating academia. And so we have all these things in place for promoting women. Granted, they're still underrepresented in some STEM fields, but in academia on whole, they now are making up the majority of people at all levels, undergrad, grad, and professors. And nobody seems all that concerned about the potential underrepresentation of men. And so we do have this double standard where we care more when women are missing than when men are missing. Why is that the case? I mean, that's complicated. I have talked about this issue before. I think some of it just I think there are 2 things. Well, one is people care more about women than they do men. This is probably for evolutionary reasons, because women are the more scarce resource and the upper limit on reproductive success in a group. So women are more valuable in some sense, and people have come to care more for women, whereas men, were engaging in combat. So we care a little bit less about their well-being than we do the well-being of women and children, of course. But the other part's cultural, because, for example, I have research showing that people are biased in favor of claims that portray women better than men. So they'll evaluate research more favorably if it says women are smarter than men or women make better leaders than men than they will if it's the reverse conclusion. And I think that must be cultural, because I think, maybe as recently as 100 years ago, certainly probably 200-300 years ago, if you were to ask people, are women smarter than men, they would have said, hell no. And now they say yes. So I think it's also just a cultural shift where we have, these more progressive values. I don't think I answered your question, or maybe I did, I'm not sure. Did I? I don't know. You can let me know if not.
I think you did. I think you did.
Okay.
So Anton has the next one. Could it be cultural upbringing and personal sensitivity that shapes self-censorship behavior?
That's a good question. Those are certainly both possible. Personal sensitivity, I would think almost for certain. People who are very averse to interpersonal conflict or criticism, those people I think would be more likely to self-censor than people who kind of don't care what other people think or say about them. That's probably an individual difference. Cultural upbringing, perhaps too. I don't have any data to answer that question. I would like to see other people study this in different cultures, and especially what would this look like in China, for example, where certain kinds of censorship are more, the government actually is censoring people more, and I think it's very accepted that they do. People don't have much of a concern about it in the way in the US people freak out if they think something's being censored. So yeah, I think those are possible. The only data I really have that are relevant are just, I know that the people who believe these conclusions are true are self-censoring more. So people who have come over time to accept these conclusions as true, people who potentially would pay a higher reputational price are self-censoring more. But yeah, those are good ideas, and I hope you'll study them.
Another very interesting question. So thank you for your research. Do you think the opinion of students is also a factor that influence professors, or is it vice versa? It is
That's,
most. Mhm.
sorry.
It continues to say it is mostly students who are very vocal about these topics. Would you be interested in studying the opinions of students as well?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And in fact, I saw a talk on this recently. I think it was a presentation by Fire, but I'm not 100% sure. And they were looking at what better explains, yeah, it was Fire. So they have this Scholars Under Fire data set where they've compiled a huge list of scholars who have been sanctioned by their universities for their speech, sometimes in teaching, sometimes in their research, sometimes on podcasts, whatever. But and then they looked at whether how progressive the professors are or how progressive the students are better predicts sanctions. And the answer is students. So I do think the students have a lot of power. And I do think the students are contributing to the intimidation. And in fact, even in my interviews, I had professors explicitly say, like, I'm afraid if I say the wrong thing, my students will, maybe my student's an influencer and they'll post it on TikTok and I'll become known as a globally known as a villain. So people are scared of their students, but I do think it raises another issue, which is who's responsible for giving the students that much power, and should somebody be taking responsibility for that? If a student or a student group complains or boycotts or something, usually there's an administrator or somebody who can say, I'm sorry you didn't like the class, you can drop it, and doesn't go ahead and punish the professor. So I think there's a bit of a maybe a diffusion of responsibility where we think the students are sometimes really intimidating because they can be, and they start these huge petitions, and sometimes they have a lot of followers on Twitter or elsewhere, and it can be really scary. But they don't make the decisions at universities, the administrators do. And sometimes peers do too, because they get to vote on these things sometimes. So I think even if it is largely driven by the students, then we have to ask, why are we letting the students have that much control over academic outputs? So,
Because in a sense, Cory, that would explain the discrepancy between the fear that people have and what they themselves say that, they are not willing to censor, right? But if they find that it's not the academics themselves, but the students or other forces, you know,
yeah, I mean, there was, so
that
for
fear
like,
from somewhere, right? I mean, I guess it is
yeah,
not made up.
yeah. So like the one that's pure ostracism, that seems to be overestimated, and that would be specifically their peers. Although it is of course possible that if the student mob formed and my colleague is being attacked, I don't want to ostracize them, but I don't want to get in trouble with the students. So, okay, I'm not going to talk to that person anymore. Of course, that's possible. Yeah, so that could be to explain some of the discrepancy. I don't know if that's all of it, but it's certainly possible that the students have control over even how we evaluate and treat each other.
I mean, but it's a fair point, since it's not the students themselves, it's how the administration takes notice of students' opinions or so, right? So
Right,
ultimately, the students directly, right?
right, yeah.
Okay, can you elaborate a bit more? What is really implied by moral grounds? Is this genuine fear of detrimental consequences of controversial research? Or is this driven by prudential reasons, for instance, to drive certain diversity agendas, or something else, party loyalty or the like?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the people who advocate for harm concerns. They use the word like harmful, but it's specific harms, right? Like, so yeah, they're talking about harm, but they're talking about specific harms and they're not talking about other specific harms. So I do think it's a sort of politicized concern in the sense that, for example, in these Nature Springer guidelines, they talk about undermining the dignity of human social groups. What I think they mean by that is conclusions, literally exactly what I'm talking about, the taboo conclusions, conclusions that portray certain groups in a negative way, and particularly groups that we consider to be currently in a vulnerable position. They're not talking about other kinds of harms. And the list of harms, you know, it could be infinite. Like, what of all the things that we should be concerned about? And, you know, why not be concerned for upholding the institution of science or trust in science or preventing the spread of conspiracy theories? Like, these are things that could be considered, but they're not. So yeah, when I say on the basis of harm concerns, that could be meant to imply any sort of harm, but I don't think that's what's actually happening. It's not any harm, it's specific harm. And that specific harm is something that is a progressive value. And so these institutions that are trying to add harm concerns as a legitimate criterion for scientific evaluation, I suspect it's mostly all coming from the left. Yeah.
This is more of a personal question, which, you know, I'm not sure where you feel comfortable in answering, but, you know, feel free to pass it or answer it. How many of your colleagues support you, your paper topic, and your view of how science should work to produce objective results?
Yeah, so I think if you asked me that question 3 years ago, I would have said that I'm like enemy number one. And I knew a lot of people supported me. A lot of people over the years have told me that they support me, and people thank me all the time for studying these kinds of things. So I know I have plenty of friends, but a lot of people have said horrible things about me. But over time, as I've been studying this topic, more and more now, I actually think probably most people support me, and it's actually just a handful of outspoken and, let's say, not super professional people who really dislike me. And once you kind of know these people hate you, and they should hate you because they don't support what you're doing, then you can kind of start to care a little bit less about being hated. But most people are really nice to me. So yeah.
It's a very
And I
nice
get
comment.
invited to talk to you cool people, so it's going well.
This is a very nice comment from Anton as well. We are used to censorship by dictatorial governments. But if censorship by students drive focus and results of research, the academic world could become very vulnerable to passions, fickle behaviors, or even sabotage. Hope you could come up with an active defense.
I wish I could too.
That's a very nice comment. There's
my
another.
only this is my defense. My defense is show people where people stand and hope it gives people courage to speak up more, not just professors to speak up for each other and to refuse to participate in these things, but hopefully also to embolden. I don't know how we get to admin, but as I said, like professor and admin doesn't have to bend to these students. Like, for example, you guys probably, maybe you didn't hear of it, it was a US thing, but there was a professor, Yoel Imbar's his name. He's from Canada, actually. But anyway, he had a job offer at UCLA, and the grad students started this petition because he had said something like, he's not sure DEI accomplishes what it says it's going to accomplish. And because of the grad students, they rescinded, or sorry, I think it was implied that he was going to have it. Anyway, they ended up not hiring him, and it seemed to be pretty much 100% because of this grad student petition. And the professors decided to take that petition seriously. They could have said, we're sorry you don't like him. You're only here for another 1 to 5 years. We're here the rest of our lives. We get to control who our colleagues are. But they didn't do that. But, you know, I hope if I'm right and most people are against this kind of thing, then it's up to us to speak up about it and, you know, take control back over our own institutions. Like, you know, we're the ones who pay the price for this kind of thing, so we have to take responsibility for it, I think.
And a very interesting point by Geoff. As the proportion of university faculty who are female increases, do you think that some of the trends you have identified could get stronger?
Yeah, so I've written a little bit about this. I'm actually considering potentially writing a book about it, although some people have discouraged me. Yeah, no, I think part of the reason we have this conflict is precisely because of the rapid increase of women in academia, because, you know, they're also the majority of students and people don't want to say no to them. So I think the increase of women in science and academia and higher education is perhaps one of the most contributing, if not the single most contributing factor to this becoming a conflict in science. And yes, I think if we continue to get more women, it will become more of a thing. And potentially it will just be the normal thing in like 10 or 20 years that will be saying, no, science, the purpose of science is to pursue the truth so long as that truth is good and helpful and not, we would not publish. And if that's true, or rather if that happens, then I think what would have to happen is academia is no longer the place that does science and instead like think tanks that have more control over their work would be the ones pursuing truth. That's maybe super pessimistic. I should say, like, I also know really smart people who, because as I say here, like, even though women are more supportive of all of these things, most people aren't supportive of them. So it's not all women. It's not even most women. It's some women and it's some men too. So if the majority of people still oppose these things, then potentially academia could withstand this influx of women. And especially, as I said, like if we could collect empirical data, like if we could show women that, and men, anyone who's concerned about harms, if we could show them with data, publishing this type of finding isn't going to cause genocide, well then maybe we don't need to worry about it anymore. So like there are other ways of trying to address this issue. But yes, I agree with you that it's possibly true that that the trends could get stronger. And that the increase in women is potentially a primary cause of these moral things.
Let me read you one of the comments and then I will finally get to ask you my last question, you know, like I've been patiently waiting, you know, for everyone else. So this is for Simon Lucas. Fascinating study. I have certainly been a victim of pluralistic ignorance. Your results really contradict some intuitions that arise from following public debate. To an outsider, it often seems that social psychology or the social sciences more broadly are driven by insatiable desires to censor controversial research, even on less contentious topics than those presented in your analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there are two reasons for that being in the social sciences specifically. One is because there are more women in the social sciences, and two is because the social sciences study the topics that are related to the consumer of science. So, you know, butterflies can't be concerned about what we say about them, so they can't interfere with science, but humans can be concerned with what we say about humans. So the fact that people who are studying humans. So if you look at, for example, some of these other data sets that have been conducted by nonprofit types of organizations, usually, it is true that scientists, or rather academics in the social sciences and humanities, self-censor more and are more censored by other people than people in STEM. And I don't know that it's necessarily that social sciences are so much more consequential for their world. I think they're probably less consequential, but I think they're censored more just because we're saying things about humans, and humans get upset when you say things about them. So yeah, I don't know what you do about that. But it is true. Yeah, your point is, you're correct. Yeah.
Let me ask you more of a value question, but I said one of the things that your analysis revealed is that we don't necessarily have a shared understanding of what science is about, like the values of it, right? Do we value the truth? Do we value the truth that is good? Do we value, so don't you think that we need to have a common, like if we are in all of the, like if science is like a company, we have to align on a mission, right? And that mission should be commonly understood, commonly accepted, and from there, the values and the practices will come from, right? So then you wouldn't fear, because if you actually align with the values of the company, then there's nothing to fear. So I wonder, like, how much of the fears that you unravel have something to do with the fact that we are a collective, but we're not collectively seeking the same thing.
Yeah, I think so. There is some research on this, and what you see is, whereas men are more likely to say the purpose of science is to pursue truth, women are more likely to say the purpose of science is to make the world a better place, or to use science to do good. And people need to study this question more, because I do think these different philosophies of science, like, they both make sense, because even from the truth perspective, and I've tried to talk to this about people, like, how do we justify that? Like, how do you justify, no, truth only, not truth for good? And the way I find myself justifying it is, the truth is so useful for good, right? So it's the same thing. It's like, some people are saying, no, we should only pursue truth. We should not pursue truths that are harmful, that cause stereotypes, that create interpersonal conflict, etc. Well, I'm saying, no, we should pursue truth regardless. But that's because when we don't have the truth, we make really ineffective policies, and we believe all this false stuff that makes us bad at solving problems in the world. So I'm still appealing to the same thing, So it's hard to know how we could resolve that conflict, because it's a value, right? It's not an empirical claim. But yeah, I agree with you. If we, for example, when you bring grad students in, if we all wanted to do this, we said, like, in science, we pursue truth. There are other, there are policymakers, there are activists, and those people are solving concrete problems in the world. They have an agenda. And science, the agenda is truth. And we let other people apply that truth to make the world a better place. Our job is just the truth. If you could teach that to grad students and get grad students to buy into that, and we had that shared understanding, then maybe, because I don't think I was ever taught that. I don't remember ever being taught that in grad school. So maybe if we had those kinds of courses for all scientists, all grad students who go into science, then maybe we could get on the same page. But yeah, it's a hard debate to deal with.
Yeah, so I guess at the background of my question, Cory, is I agree with you that, say everybody should be introduced into the norms and principles and values, say, of what the pursuit of science is. But that, so my question to you is more like, do we have that shared understanding at all? And what I think your data seems to reveal is, like, no, different groups seems to actually have different values, right? And then when these values get in conflict, because you can think of the taboos is when one value it's in conflict with another value. So the truth is in conflict with the good, right? And so under those, value contradictions, then some people say, well, no, what comes actually first is leave the world a better place, right? As opposed to the truth, or the way around, right? But I think the sticky point is, without a shared understanding, it's going to be very difficult to resolve these issues that you just, unravel, right? Because some people will resolve them one way, some other people will resolve them another way, and it will be actually random, because you don't know with whom you're dealing. You know what I
Right.
mean? That in some institutions they value more the truth, and in some others they value more like the good, right?
Mhm.
You know, at least the Nature editorial is clear on no, we value, you know, the good,
Yeah.
right? Not the truth, right?
Yeah.
So in a sense, I think that you know, part of your beautiful research also shows that we need to have a very important conversation,
Mhm.
right? Like, what are we doing? You know, and what do we really like if you know, if things get dirty, you know, you know, like, I mean, some values contradict others, like which ones are we going to pick,
Right.
right? Because that will eliminate fear in some sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
think it's gotten to be pretty ugly and unpleasant, because we're not on the same page and we're just not in a good position to come to an agreement on it. And so that's why, like, I don't think I can see many things more urgent than trying to solve this, because, you know, it can undermine the entire institution of science, and people already don't trust science. And, you know, us fighting about this kind of stuff in public on Twitter and calling each other names, it's like very unprofessional and very unproductive. Yeah, so yeah,
Would you
I
have
haven't solved the problem, but I'm working on it.
but would you have a suggestion on how to, you know, reach this common understanding? Like, what would it take?
One thing I've done, so for example, I had a paper I published a year-ish, maybe 2 years ago, called Harm, Hypervigilance, and Public Reactions to Scientific Evidence. And what I found is that people overestimate the harms of controversial scientific conclusions. So people think, like, for example, that El Shebly case of the paper that showed that female mentees of female mentors have less productive careers than male mentees of male mentors. And I had people actually read that paragraph and then, like, say, if this got out into the world, how likely would it be that these things would happen? And I had people say, like, how much do you support these things, and how much do you think other people support these things? I think I even did percentages because I wanted to get ground truth. So, do you support this? For example, discourage women from approaching female mentors. And people always overestimate how many people will support the bad thing. So that's one piece of empirical evidence I'm trying to say, look, we might have a bias where we exaggerate the likely harms of science. We think people are worse than they are and that they'll do more bad things on the basis of empirical claims. So that's one thing. Like, and so I think just working to demonstrate empirically that some of our intuitions and assumptions are wrong, could help provide, you know, the evidence necessary to defend the truth. But yeah, we'll see. It's a big job.
Thank you, Cory. This was fascinating, you know. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you for having me. This was a really great group. You guys had really good questions.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening or the rest of the day, and enjoy. Till the next one. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye. Okay, let's see. How do I get